Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. John Andrew Morrow. And today's discussion is based on his book titled Muhammad and the Christians Commemorating the Covenants of the Prophet. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment just below that. With that being said, John, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Before we continue and before you give your presentation, can you tell the audience a little bit about what your book is about?
The book is about the covenants of the prophets. So the covenants are written treaties attributed to Prophet Muhammad, issued to specific Christian communities in the 7th century. They include covenants with the Christians of Najran, the monks of Mount Sinai, the Christians of Persia, and the Christians of the world. They also include the Constitution of Medina, which was a covenant that was made between the Prophet Muhammad and the predominantly Jewish communities that inhabited Medina at the time. They would also include the Treaty of Makna and the Treaty of Ayla, which were made with Christian and Jewish communities. There were also covenants that were made with Yemenite Jews. Now, these documents are very important, and they provide remarkably consistent protections. Protection of life and property, protection of churches and monasteries and synagogues, no forced conversion, no interference with clergy, fair taxation, and religious freedom for Christian or Jewish women who married Muslims. So Christians and Jews were not second-class citizens or guests in Islam. They were protected partners under the Prophet's authority, at least in the 7th century under his rule.
All right. So the presentation that you were talking about, if it's a slideshow, are you going to be sharing screens or?
I will just speak.
Okay.
And if you have any questions along the way, if there are any questions on the part of viewers, feel free to interject, and I can elaborate on some of the points that I make. So Muhammad and the Christians, my latest work, is yet another link in a solid scholarly chain that has seen phenomenal growth since the publication of the Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world in 2013. Within a span of 10 years, the work motivated 2 exhibits, one by the Ahmadiyya World Community, which is a traveling exhibit, and the other by the International Museum of Muslim Cultures in Jackson, Mississippi. They've done some outstanding work over the years. They have all kinds of interesting exhibits on Timbuktu and so on. If anyone is in the area of Jackson, Mississippi, by all means, visit the International Museum of Muslim Cultures, where they have an exhibit on Christians and Muslims. Which focuses on coexistence. The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad inspired numerous academic books by Ibrahim Zain, Ahmed El-Wakil, and Craig Considine, and scores of scholarly articles in peer-reviewed journals. So you can just go to Google Scholar and search for Ashtinameh or Covenants of the Prophet or any similar terms, and you will find that there's been just an avalanche of publications on the Covenants of the Prophet since 2013. As for my work, The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the World, it was cited over 1,000 times in scholarly and popular sources within 10 years of its publication in 2013. It mobilized diplomats and politicians. It galvanized diplomatic and interfaith efforts. It became a core component in combating radicalization and violent extremism. It's used in many nations to de-radicalize extremists. It was also instrumental in saving the life of Asiya Bibi, the Christian Pakistani woman who was wrongly accused of blasphemy and condemned to death. The Chief Justice from the Supreme Court of Pakistan cited the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world in his ruling, in which he freed and liberated Asiya Bibi. What's more, the revival of the covenants of the Prophet has resulted in the rediscovery of documents in monasteries, archives, and collections throughout the world. This current book, Muhammad and the Christians, is sound in its premise, major arguments, and methodology. So this is not a faith-based work. It's scientific, it's scholarly, it's historical critical, it's evidence-based. My only agenda is the truth and the facts. So prior to passing judgment, neutral, objective, and impartial readers who are not motivated by ideology, spin, agenda, geopolitics, and propaganda should become well-versed with the scholarship in the field and become familiar with both the primary and secondary sources on the subject. So these letters, treaties, and covenants of the Prophet have existed since the dawn of Islam. They were, however, scattered throughout the Islamic literary tradition, which is vast. So these treaties and covenants and letters were found in biographies of the Prophet. They were found in books of hadith or compilations of sayings attributed to the Prophet. They were found in books of Islamic jurisprudence. So they were all scattered. The first scholar to combine them, to collect them, and to publish them in one document was a scholar by the name of Muhammad Hamidullah. It's an Arabic work called Majmu' al-Watha'iq al-Siyasiyya fi al-Ahad al-Nabawi wal-Khalifa al-Rashida, the collection of political documents of the Prophet's era and the rightly guided caliphs. So we're grateful to him for his work. There was an Iranian Ayatollah by the name of Ali Ahmadi Miyanji who expanded upon Hamidullah's collection, including documents that are found in Shiite sources. He published a multi-volume work called Makatib al-Rasul, or the Letters of the Messenger. Another Ayatollah named Hassan Shirazi published Kalima al-Rasul al-Azam, the words of the greatest messenger, again, including more material and so on. In English, we had Craig Considine, who published People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. If you haven't had him on your show, by all means, he would be a great guest to host. And Ibrahim Muhammad Zain and Ahmed al-Wakil, two scholars I highly recommend, based out of Qatar, who recently published The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad from Shared Historical Reality to Peaceful Coexistence. I'm sure viewers would be interested in hearing about all of their discoveries and all of their arguments. And of course, I've published studies on the covenants of the Prophet in many of my other books, Restoring the Balance, the Islamic Interfaith Initiative, The Messenger of Mercy, and so on. So the opponents of the covenants of the Prophet are almost invariably Islamists or Islamophobes, right? They're not like middle-of-the-road people. They're either Muslim fundamentalists who follow in the footsteps of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Muslim Brotherhood, and their extremist predecessors, or some of them are Zionists, some of them are Christian fundamentalists, some of them are Islamophobes. Either way, they share the same violent and intolerant vision of Islam and reinforce each other's narrative. So they're basically two sides of the same coin. Prejudiced, biased, they're oblivious to the scholarship on the subject, or ignore it altogether, repeating ad nauseum their unfounded allegations that the covenants of the prophet are late forgeries without providing any evidence to support their claims. Who forged them? When? Where is the proof? Yes, that's the issue there. So when scholars speak of the covenants of the prophet, they're referring to the body of official letters, treaties, edicts, compacts, correspondence, and other documents that Muhammad, the messenger of God, composed over the course of his 23-year mission. The first of which was the Covenant of Medina, which is widely accepted as historically authentic, even by the most stringent of scholars, due to its content and archaic features. So Muhammad received revelation, and he preached for about a decade in Mecca. He was persecuted. Then the people of Yathrib, which later became known as Medina an-Nabi, or the city of the prophet, invited him to be their leader, right? To bring peace to them, because they had a long history of quarreling, the Arab tribes versus the Jewish tribes. They accepted him as their leader. So the first thing he does when he arrives there is he consults with his constituents, and through a process of negotiation and consultation and debate and dialogue, came up with a document known as Sahif al-Madina, the Scroll of Medina, the Constitution of Medina, which is widely considered the earliest constitution. The interesting features of that document is that the Muslims and the Jewish people were equal. They were brothers to one another, united in justice. The Muslims had their religion, the Jews had their religion. The Muslims promised to protect the Jews promised to protect the Muslims, the Constitution of Medina. So the documents in question, which number in the hundreds, are found scattered throughout the vast canonical Islamic corpus of the Sunnis and Shiites. When compiled, they fill several encyclopedic-sized volumes. These precious texts, which in the view of many scholars represent the real and representative prophetic sunnah or example, and which are drawn from scores of authoritative Muslim sources, were finally compiled by Muhammad Hamidullah, Hassan Shirazi, and Ali Ahmadi Mianji. And I was the first to translate and edit and comment and analyze these documents in the English language. The work was also published in Arabic. It was published in Spanish. It was published in Italian. It had a tremendous impact. So the existing collections of prophetic covenants, which were published together for the first time in the 20th century, are supplemented by other documents rediscovered in archives by researchers in the 21st century. So in addition to all of those that we had in Islamic sources, we also uncovered other documents that were kept in Christian monasteries, for example. The covenants of the prophet contained in Ali Ahmadi Mianji's Makatib al-Rasul have been subjected to critical discourse analysis. Unlike the Hadith literature, which was transmitted orally for centuries before being committed to writing 300 to 1,000 years after the passing of the prophet, in which in many cases was copied from canonical and apocryphal Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian sources, and even concocted outright, much of the letters, treaties, and covenants of the Prophet Muhammad were transmitted in written form. So the major ones, the covenants with the Christians, can be traced back through the centuries, compared, cross-referenced, confirmed, and verified. They exist not only in books, but in manuscript form, with a long, rich, and detailed scribal history and lineage. So we actually have manuscripts going back centuries and centuries and centuries. We have the names of the scribes. We have the names of the judges who notarized these documents, confirming that they were indeed genuine copies. Comically and dishonestly, critics initially claimed that the covenants of the prophet were 17th century frauds. When earlier copies surfaced, they moved the goalpost and pretended that they were 16th century forgeries from the time of Sultan Selim, who died in 1520. When this was debunked, they claimed that they were late medieval forgeries, namely between the years 1300 and 1500. When this was dismissed by documentary evidence, they pretended that the covenants of the prophet were early medieval forgeries from the time of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, who died in 1021, namely the 11th century. The fact of the matter, however, is that the covenant of the prophet acted as a precedent for Fatimid decrees, which date from 965, 1024, 1109, 1110, 1135, 1154, and 1156. Caliph al-Muiz, al-Aziz, al-Hakim, al-Zahir, al-Afdad, al-Hafid, they all extended their protection to their Christian subjects based on the covenant of the prophet. So since the covenant of the prophet clearly does not date from the time of al-Hakim, will cynics, dissenters, doubters, scoffers postulate that the covenants of the prophet are 9th century forgeries? Well, indeed they have. In fact, when presented the evidence that Habib the monk found a covenant of the prophet in the Abbasid archives in 878, these pettifoggers claimed that it was a 9th century Christian forgery. So you can see when these documents first circulated in the Western world in the 17th century, they claimed that they were recent forgeries. So they went from 17th century, 16th, and 15th, and they keep pushing it back and back and back. You know, basically, if we had an autograph, an original copy of one of these covenants, written by the Prophet Muhammad himself, signed and sealed, some of these scholars, I fear, would still claim that the document was a forgery. So if the paper trail of the covenants of the prophet in terms of actual physical evidence and palpable, datable documents currently traces as far back as Fatimid times, namely the 900s, the literary trail dates to the dawn of Islam. For a full picture of the genealogy of these documents from the 21st century back to the 7th century, readers should consult Islam and the People of the Book, Critical Studies on the Covenants of the Prophet. This is a 3-volume encyclopedia in which I track every single reference I could find in any language to these documents from the 21st century all the way back to the 7th century. So all historical works that have come down to us inform us that the Prophet Muhammad wrote documents to Jews and Christians or give descriptions of their contents that are in harmony with the covenants. Ishoyahab III, who died in 659. So remember, Muhammad 570 to 632, okay? 632. So Ishoyahab III, who died in 659, mentioned the covenants of the prophet. Sebeos, who died in 661, did as well. John Bar Penkaye, who died in 687, mentioned the protections and the privileges that the Prophet Muhammad granted to Christian communities. And I can give the citations from these early Christian his chroniclers, if you so desire. Musa ibn Uqba, now he died in 758. To date, he wrote the earliest biography, extant biography of the prophet that we know of. He also mentions that Muhammad protected Christian communities. Ibn Ishaq, the author of one of the earliest biographies of the prophet, also mentions this fact. Ibn Hisham, who died in 833, Muqatil, Now, he's the author of one of the earliest tafsirs or commentaries of the Quran. He also mentions the covenants of the Prophet. So he died in 767. Abu Yusuf, who died in 798, Al-Bakri, Al-Shaybani, Yahya ibn Adam, Abu Ubaid, Al-Waqidi, Al-Hashimi, Al-Tabari, Ibn Sa'd, Ibn Abi Shayba, Ibn Zanjaway, Abu Dawood, Habib the Monk, Al-Baladhuri, Al-Yaqubi, Nicholas I, Agapius of Hierapolis, Masudi ibn Hibban. We have all these Fatimid decrees that mention the covenants of the prophets. Abu Nuwaym, Maris, Al-Samakhshari, Al-Razi, Shirkuk. The Ayyubids issued all kinds of decrees in which they mention the covenants of the prophet. They renew all the privileges and protections. So the Ayyubids did it, the Mamluks did it. Ibn Asakir mentions them, Al-Fariqi, Fakhruddin al-Razi, Ibn al-Athir, Ibn al-Amid, Bar Hebraeus, Ibn Sayyid al-Nas, Abu al-Feda, Amrus, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, Al-Haythami, Al-Qalqashandi, Al-Busuri, Al-Asqalani, Al-Qastalani, Feriuddin Bey, who was in charge of the Ottoman archives in 1583, Ahmed ben Joseph, Shah Abbas, Pacifique de Provins, Gabriel Sionita, and Nectarios of Sinai. I am just scratching the surface. So when we seek to determine whether a document genuinely traces back to the prophet, for example, well, we have to look at the textual tradition. We have to look at the provenance of this document. And what we see is from the 7th century until present times, we have Jewish authors, Christian authors, and Muslim authors of different sects, all mentioning that the Prophet Muhammad protected Christian communities. And these Christian authors belonged to different denominations. They spoke different languages. They were separated geographically. We have Jewish communities from northwestern Arabia who've transmitted the fact that the Prophet Muhammad protected Jewish communities. We have the same thing among the Yemenite Jews. The Sunnis have these documents in their books. The Shiites have them in their books. So what we have here, as far as I'm concerned, is an overwhelming consensus that yes, indeed, in the 7th century, Muhammad protected his Christian friends and allies. So, as far as serious literary and textual critics are concerned, those who trace the history of ideas over time, the principles contained in the covenants of the prophet are real or genuine according to their historical context. Their meaning matches the message of Muhammad, who provided protection or dhimma to the people under his authority. Their authenticity is determined by their genuineness and truthfulness. As Ahmed al-Wakil, Ibrahim Zain, and Halim Ran have noted, it is generally agreed in Muslim and non-Muslim sources that the Prophet Muhammad and the first caliphs of Islam issued treaties of protection to the non-Muslim communities of their time, leaving little room to doubt that authentic historical agreements once existed. As these treaties generally had few provisions, their laissez-faire approach permitted the development of a living tradition that allowed non-Muslim communities to carry out their activities without interference from the Islamic government, as long as they paid their taxes. The polemicists who opposed the covenants of the Prophet claim that the Pact of Umar, which was reportedly decreed in 637, is much earlier than Muhammad's so-called covenants, a work that paints a very different picture of how Muslims are supposed to treat Christians. All Real historians like A.S. Triton and Mahmoud al-Denawi, among others, are aware that the Pact of Umar is a fake and a fraud. Its textual history proves that it was false from the start, a literary forgery from the 9th century, and that it grew exponentially more intolerant over the centuries, reaching the pinnacle of oppression in the 12th century. From version to version, we see how the stipulations became increasingly restrictive. As Ahmed al-Wakil, Ibrahim Zain, and Halim Ran have observed, the initial treaties that Muslims made with non-Muslims were non-intrusive, with few, if any, restrictions. Importantly, some of these agreements even conform to the covenants attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, presenting a self-image of the nascent Muslim community as rulers committed to justice who were religiously bound to protect different faith communities. Over time, however, more and more restrictions were placed on the local non-Muslim populations, beginning with the decrees of the Umayyad Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and culminating with the edicts of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mutawakkil, after which the Pact of Umar took its final form. As much as some Muslim jurists attempted to be practical, accommodating, and pragmatic, the trajectory of imperial policy, shaped by the enactments of rulers and the selective emphasis on certain Islamic texts over others, ultimately led to the curtailment of the laissez-faire approach. This shift altered interreligious dynamics, prompting Muslim authorities to devise treaties that prioritize the rights of Muslims over those of non-Muslims. The Pact of Umar, which was a fluid text, does not disprove the covenants of the Prophet, which remained remarkably stable during the early centuries of Islam. In fact, it proves their existence. For a counter-narrative to exist, an original narrative must exist as well. The Pact of Umar was an act of protest directed at the covenants of the Prophet. As Ahmed al-Wakil, Ibrahim Zain, and Halim Ran conclude, the covenants legitimized a level of religious freedom that did not resonate with the norms, regulations, and religious sensitivities of the Abbasid cultural milieu. The imperial policy of Muslim caliphs toward local communities, coupled with the issuance of treaties with new provisions, facilitated shifting legal boundaries, resulting in the formulation of a text first attributed to Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, and then at a secondary stage after the reign of al-Mutawakkil to Umar ibn al-Khattab. The Pact of Umar thus emerged as a competing text to the covenants, bearing a complex legal history that goes beyond historical authenticity. So, let me get into the contributions of Muhammad and the Christians. The first chapter is titled The Quranicity of the Prophet's Covenants. It establishes the scriptural foundation of the pledges and promises that the messenger of God made with the Christians. Critics have complained that the covenants of the Prophet contradict the Quran. This study shows that the covenants are completely consonant with the Quranic worldview. In fact, they clarify the text and its tolerant and inclusive context. So what I do in chapter 1 is I take the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of Najran, and I compare it, I go through it line by line, clause by clause, principle by principle, and compare it to the Quran. And every single line in the covenant of Najran is supported by a Quranic verse. Does this mean that they have the same author? Maybe, maybe not, but whoever authored the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of Najran was a person who was deeply immersed in the Quranic worldview, who knew the text inside out and who embodied its teachings. And so from a Muslim point of view, when we look at a document, we ask ourselves, does it or does it not agree with the Quran? If it contradicts the Quran, if it disagrees with the Quran, then we toss it in the trash, right? We debunk it. This is one of the standards that we use to determine that something is not authentic from an Islamic point of view. In terms of the covenants of the Prophet, they're completely consonant with the Quran. So, from an Islamic point of view, no objections can be made to their content. The second chapter examines Muhammad Mount Sinai and the mystical eagle. And so, according to the monks from St. Catherine's Monastery, when Muhammad was a young man, he visited their monastery, perhaps as part of a trade caravan, perhaps as part of a pilgrimage, but in any event, according to tradition or according to legend, there was an eagle that was hovering over young Muhammad, protecting him from the harsh rays of the sun. And the abbot, who at the time was probably St. John Climacus, the author of the Book of Ladders, noticed that this was highly unusual and yes, was very symbolic. So he invited young Muhammad into the monastery and told him that he foresaw that he would become a great and powerful leader, that he would become a prophet. And in the event that he did, was he willing to promise to protect the monastery and the monks and Christians and Christianity? And according to tradition, Muhammad said that he would. A piece of paper was brought to him, some ink as well, and Muhammad dipped his hand in the ink and he sealed this document. Now, the years passed on, and what the abbot foretold came true. And word reached the monks at the monastery of St. Catherine that there was this new leader, Muhammad, a new prophet who'd established, his rule over Medina. And so a delegation of monks came to visit Muhammad, and they told him, listen, you visited us, you promised to protect us, will you honor your pledge? And he said that he did, at which point, and this is in the second year of the Hijrah, he dictated the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of St. Catherine's Monastery, or the monks of Mount Sinai. So according to tradition. So that chapter studies all of the symbolism that surrounds, all of the mythic substrata that surrounds the Ashtiname, or the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the monks from St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt. The third chapter studies Gabriel Sionita and the covenant at the University of Cambridge. So Gabriel Sionita was a Maronite monk who lived and worked and taught in France. And in 1630, he published a work called the Testamentum et Pactiones, or the Ahad wa Shurut, the covenant of the Prophet with the Christians. Now, it was accepted as genuine and authentic by many scholars at the time. There were some more skeptical scholars who thought that it was a Christian forgery. This chapter studies all of the controversies revolving around said document. And I conclude that the document that he published in Arabic and that he translated into Latin, which became a bestseller in Europe, was actually a copy of an official Ottoman document, analogous to manuscript 831 at John Ryland's library in Manchester, and manuscript 1901 at the University of Cambridge. So the Ottomans revived this covenantal tradition, and the covenants of the Prophet became part of their domestic and foreign policy. Christian communities were granted tremendous liberty, tremendous autonomy. They were able to collect taxes. They used to judge their Christian communities based on Christian canon law. So they were very autonomous in that regard. The Ottomans used to issue copies of the Covenants of the Prophet for public display in churches and monasteries. And so all of the patriarchates and so on, they have these copies of the Covenant of the Prophet. It was a way of signaling that these Christians are under the protection of God and Muhammad and the Sultan, and no harm can come to them. In fact, the small copies of the covenants were given to individual monks, and they would roll them up and stick them in their sash or their belt when they were traveling. So they served as passports. So they could travel anywhere throughout the Ottoman Empire. They can collect tithe, they could preach the religion, they could cater to their congregations. So that was chapter 3. Chapter 4 examines an Arabic Garshuni covenant of the Prophet from Mar Behna Monastery in Iraq. And so this document surfaced during the ISIS crisis. Daesh terrorists were going around slaughtering Christians, burning down, destroying monasteries, burning ancient manuscripts. And some very brave monks were able to save some of these precious documents. Among them was an Arabic Garshuni covenant of the Prophet. Now, yes, Garshuni is Arabic, but written using the Syriac script. So, was it transcribed from Arabic, or was it a translation into Arabic from a Syriac original? Could the Prophet Muhammad have corresponded in Syriac with Christian ecclesiastic leaders in the Middle East in the 7th century? In any event, the provenance of the document is intriguing. Chapter 5 deals with the art of the covenant. It analyzes the significance of the artistic symbolism found in approximately 20 covenants. The imagery in the covenants of the Prophet is worth 1,000 words. They're aesthetic tools of communication. With their written content and artwork, the covenants of the Prophet are literary and artistic masterpieces that form an integral part of world heritage and should be cherished as such. So bringing together history, religion, and art adds richness, color, and context to the covenants of the Prophet. It brings them vividly to life and shows how much they were loved and revered by artists and art aficionados, by Muslims, and by Orthodox Christians who proudly displayed them in their monasteries, churches, cathedrals, and in the seats of their patriarchates. If God is beautiful and loves beauty, as the Prophet Muhammad is cited as saying, the art of the covenant is an aesthetic act of adoration. So for art lovers, please explore the art of the covenant. The 6th chapter addresses the Christians of Najran, their encounter with the Prophet Muhammad, its outcome and its symbolism. It exposes and examines 2 conflicting and incompatible portraits, one of mutual recognition and peaceful coexistence on the part of an Islam of love, mercy, kindness, and compassion, and the other of humiliation and subjugation on the part of an imperialist and supremacist Islam. So one's vision and understanding of the meeting between the Prophet Muhammad and the Christians of Najran has consequences that can color, contaminate, or poison our conception of Christian-Muslim relations, past, present, and future. The 7th and the final chapter asks the critical question: were the covenants of the Prophet ever categorically negated? They may have been marginalized, ignored, cast aside, or suppressed, but were they ever definitively debunked and denounced as frauds by Muslim authorities? A cross comparison between the covenant of protection of Imam al-Shafi'i, who's the founder of one of the Sunni schools of jurisprudence, and the covenant of the prophet convincingly shows that this was not the case. The prophet's covenants could never be completely circumvented. Truth be told, some bonds and chains need to be broken, yet others are ties that bind people and communities positively and that need to be strengthened. So I hope and pray that Muhammad and the Christians may be a worthy link in that chain, one that fortifies faith, stands for justice, and calls for compassion, mercy, and most centrally, love. Muhammad and the Christians does not endeavor to persuade readers of an alternate Islamic history. It does not pretend that Islam is and has always been a tolerant religion, despite competing discourses and opposing realities. No religion can make such claims, not Judaism, not Christianity, and not Islam. It does not feign that Islam has been merely misunderstood by many. Muhammad and the Christians does not deny the horrors of the past and the present. However, neither does it deny its glories. It shows what Islam could have been and should have been had Muslims faithfully followed the Quran and the covenants as they were truly taught by the Prophet Muhammad. So this is not a work of historical revisionism. It is one of historical analysis, criticism, and religious aspiration. It demonstrates that many Muslims, at all points in Islamic history, upheld the perennial principles espoused in the Quran and the covenants of the Prophet. So, to critics and cynics out there, please fault not those who work for peace. So that's enough for my a little bit lengthy overview of Muhammad and the Christians. I'm open to any questions you may have, concerning the work.
I did have some questions, but as you continued in your presentation, you've pretty much answered them.
Sure. So basically, it's important to distinguish between prophetic Islam and institutional Islam. And what I mean by prophetic Islam is Islam as practiced and embodied by Muhammad. That's no easy task, all right? So as you know, the vision we have of Islam today, our understanding of Islam is very much an Abbasid version of Islam. The Quran is a 7th century document that is well established and well accepted in the field. It is a 7th century document. The problem is nothing else appears in the literary record until about 150 years later, where some biographies start to appear. And maybe 200, 300 years later, we start to see compilations of the sayings of the Prophet. We also have commentaries of the Quran, but they're quite late. And so our understanding of Islam dates essentially from the Umayyad period. There's barely anything from the Umayyad period. So what did Islam look like in the 7th century in Medina during Muhammad's time? This is what we're trying to get back to, all right? And we need to distinguish between that and the institutional Islam, the Islam as governed by empires and jurists after his death. So during Muhammad's lifetime, Islam operated through personal authority. Governance was covenant-based. The whole concept of covenants, the covenant of God with Adam, the covenant of God with Abraham and with Moses and the children of Israel, and so on. It's just that whole covenantal theology is pervasive in the Quran, so it only makes sense that it would manifest itself in these covenants made with various communities. So governance was covenant-based, and religious minorities were integrated and not marginalized. After his death, however, the Umayyad and Abbasid empires prioritized political stability. Jurists codified law under imperial conditions, and restrictions on Christians increased. So anyone who conducts a survey of Islamic jurisprudence from the earliest sources to the present will see invariably that Islamic law becomes stricter and stricter and stricter and more intolerant and more extreme over time. And so restrictions on Christians increased. So my argument is blunt. Later Islamic law often contradicts the Prophet's own treaties. Yes. So it's the Prophet's actions that interpret the Quran and not the other way around. If Muhammad protected Christians at the height of his authority, no later interpretation can cancel that precedent. And so, I could just mention one more thing that is important.
Sure.
Right? So let me find it here. All right. Now, naturally, some people are very skeptical when it comes to, let me find my document here. Here we go. So I understand the skepticism that some people have when it comes to early sources, be they Jewish sources, Christian sources, and Islamic sources. All right? So that's textual criticism, right? That's literature. Then you have to look at history. Okay? So what actually happened? How did people behave? Right? So do things align? Right? Okay? So what people are saying in these books, is it true? Well, we've seen that, to a large extent, it isn't true, some of it. All right? And so we have to compare those sources with historical sources. We need to validate. We need to verify. There's archaeological evidence, which is very important when it comes to informing us of what happened during certain periods of time. So the literature says such and such a thing, but the archaeological evidence simply doesn't support, right, these accounts and these stories. So there's archaeological evidence and epigraphic evidence. We need to consider all of these things. So, all right, let's just assume that all of those covenants, right, are fake and forgeries and so on. We're still faced with some very persuasive evidence to the contrary. Let us take, for example, P. Nisana 77. All right? It's dated 60 years after Hijrah. So it dates from the year 680 of the Common Era. It is currently the oldest reference to the Dhimmat Allah wa Dhimmat Rasulihi, the protection of God and the protection of his messenger. It was offered to the majority Christian population of Nisana in the southwestern Negev desert on the border of what is now Israel and Egypt. All right. Now, in my book, at the front of the book, I include a copy of this document. All right, papyrus, and it's a letter sent by a political authority to a lesser political authority telling him that, wait a second, you can't treat people that way. Don't you remember that the people have dhimmat Allah wa dhimmat Rasulihi, the protection of God and the protection of his messenger. So maybe you might doubt the covenant of the prophet that was published in 1630, or you might doubt, the ones that appeared in the 14th century or the 10th century or the 9th century. Okay, but are you going to doubt this, an actual letter between political authorities under the Umayyads stating that the Christians have the protection of God and the protection of his messenger? All right, so that's basically paper. But then we're faced with Jerusalem 32. Now, this one is dated 32 after Hijrah. So this is 32 years after the Hijrah. So that's 652 CE. All right, so 570 to 632. 632 is when the Prophet Muhammad passes away. This is 20 years after his passing. And this is carved in a massive block of stone. It's the oldest attestation of the dhimmat Allah wa daman rasulihi, or the protection of God and the security and guarantee of his messenger, discovered to date. It was offered to the people of Jerusalem. So not only do we have paper documents or papyrus or whatever from the 7th century mentioning that Muhammad granted Christians, right, his protection. We have it in a big, huge, massive stone on public display for all to see. And so the Muslims came in, they established their authority, and they built monuments that said that the Christians have the protection of God and his messenger. So, to me, this is among the strongest arguments, right? And when it comes to like confirming the historicity of the protections that the Prophet Muhammad granted to the people of the book, Christian and Jewish communities of his time.
So we do have one question from the audience.
Sure.
So I'm going to take that real quick before we close. Aficionatai, thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on Muhammad as Saint Grigantus, Bishop of Arabia? Or Abraha?
Right. There are some people who claim that Muhammad did not exist, right? So they're Muhammad mythicists, right? We're all familiar with Jesus mythicism and so on, Moses mythicism. Some of these people would like us to believe that Muhammad refers to like Jesus and that it was a title, and that it didn't refer to the historical Muhammad from the Islamic tradition. So this is an argument that circulates out there. It's very much fringe. All of the scholars in this field, all of the academics, they do indeed believe that Muhammad existed as a historical character. Exactly what he taught, well, I mean, we can rely on the Quran to reconstruct that. How much we want to believe from these later traditions, that's seriously in doubt. But it's thanks to other fields that we can distinguish between what is historically accurate and what is myth and legend and imperial propaganda. I could just give you a few examples. I'm speaking in general terms. According to to Islamic sources, Arabia, right, before Muhammad and the rise of Islam, was Jahiliyyah, ignorance, right? They refer to the period of ignorance. They allege that the inhabitants of Arabia were pagans, they were polytheists, they worshipped idols, and so on. The epigraphic evidence, the archaeological evidence, simply does not support such claims. On the contrary, as scholars in the field have shown, as Ahmed al-Jalad and others, and there's a whole team of French scholars who've been working in Arabia and surrounding countries and Jordan for decades and decades and decades, we know that Arabia was Christianized at least for 200 to 300 years before the rise of Islam. Perhaps there were a few pagans here or there. To date, there really isn't any evidence to support that. Maybe there were some pagan practices. Perhaps some people were invoking deities on the side here and there. Who knows? But we're just hypothesizing. There's no evidence to support that. The evidence indicates that the Arabs were predominantly Jewish and Christian, Jews and Christians. So that does not align with Islamic sources. Islamic sources, the biographies of the Prophet, there's a whole genre of like battles and maghazi and wars. They claim that the Arabs engaged in all of these battles, massive casualties. Well, ask archaeologists, and they will tell you there is no evidence for these wars and battles during the early years and decades of Islam. No evidence at all. And this is not evidence you can cover up, right? You can't. You simply can't. So that has been greatly exaggerated, the myth of the Islamic conquest and so on.
And before we close, I'd like to remind everybody real quick, the link to purchase the book will be in the description below, and it will be in the pinned comment just below that. And with that being said, John, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Peace and blessings. Goodbye.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.